Forged from the old Prussian police, the Gestapo was born as a legal entity and ended up becoming one of the most feared secret police forces of the 20th century. In its early years, its purpose was to ensure the internal stability of the state, but under the impetus of Göring, Himmler and Heydrich, that administrative structure transformed into a tool designed to concentrate absolute power. From its headquarters in Berlin, it extended its control over all sectors of German society through a rigorous hierarchical structure and an unprecedented surveillance system. Its effectiveness relied on a surprisingly advanced record-keeping method. They used mechanized index cards to compile and cross-reference personal information, family relationships, and political activities, enabling them to identify and track any individual with precision. By the 1930s, that level of organization and control was unprecedented in Europe and foreshadowed the modern model of state intelligence. As the Third Reich expanded its dominion, the Gestapo extended its system beyond German borders, establishing delegations in France, Poland, and other occupied territories. After the war, its structure was dismantled, but many of its former members were recruited by the intelligence services of the United States and the Soviet Union, which capitalized on their expertise in espionage and counter-espionage. This documentary narrates the complete history of the Gestapo, one of the most feared and effective intelligence services of the 20th century. How fear was born, from Prussian police to a network of selective executions. Germany carried a long tradition of political surveillance. During the Revolution of 1848, King Louis I of Bavaria authorized the monitoring of opponents in local taverns. With the creation of the German Empire in 1871, the Prussian state, which encompassed most of the territory, organized its own political police under the command of Wilhelm Stieber, a lawyer and Bismarck's espionage expert. He led a network of internal and external surveillance that instructed its agents to maintain the appearance of a bourgeois lifestyle to gain the trust of their surroundings. The primary function of the Prussian political police was to control parties and individuals opposed to the government, especially communist groups. After the collapse of the empire in 1918, the new Weimar government decided to retain the Prussian political police. Its role remained focused on monitoring groups deemed dangerous to the state order. During the 1920s, investigations primarily targeted communists, though they also extended to the Nazi Party, which was still seen as an extremist movement. Before 1933, tens of thousands of judicial proceedings had already been initiated against its members and leaders. The appointment of Franz von Papen as German Chancellor on the 20th of July, 1932, transformed the Prussian political police's actions against enemies of the state. The fight against communists took center stage. Nazi leader Hermann Göring assumed effective command of the entire Prussian police, comprising 50,000 men and including the political department. Göring immediately added a special section to combat communism and dismissed 11 police chiefs sympathetic to democracy. This move aligned with the central Nazi objective of seizing control of all security services. The four key figures were Göring and Rudolf Diels in Prussia, and Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich in Bavaria. Thanks to them, the Gestapo began to take shape. Over time, Himmler and Heydrich would take control not only of the Gestapo, but of the entire Third Reich's police system, though their success was not assured at the outset. Hermann Göring, a decorated veteran of the First World War, returned to Germany aimlessly until joining the Nazi Party after hearing Hitler in 1922. He participated in the failed Munich coup of 1923, where he was wounded, and soon became one of the Nazi leader's closest collaborators. In 1932, he assumed the role of Prussian Minister of the Interior and head of the police, where he saw the opportunity to use the state apparatus for political ends. Under his command, official Rudolf Diels led the Prussian political police. Both reorganized the institution with the aim of eliminating communists and regime opponents. The Abteilung IA section, created during those years, already contained the foundation of the future organization known as the Gestapo. Göring envisioned a police force capable of combining traditional criminal methods with the harshest political repression. At the same time, in Bavaria, Heinrich Himmler and his protégé Reinhard Heydrich were developing their own intelligence structure within the SS. Himmler, meticulous and fanatical about order, was the one who turned the SS and later the Gestapo into decisive tools of Nazi terror. His organizational talent and obsession with ideological purity allowed him to recruit loyal young men who shared his vision of the total state. Heinrich, a former naval officer, brought coldness and efficiency. His skill in planning and complete lack of scruples made him indispensable. Himmler placed him in charge of the new security service, from where he began coordinating information, pursuing adversaries, and building the core of the surveillance system that would later formally merge with the Gestapo. In 1932, the IC section was renamed the Security Service, or SD, an organization designed to act more proactively than its predecessor and to locate political and racial enemies for detention. Even before 1933, Himmler and Heinrich were already seeking to transfer the racial and elitist principles of the SS to the new secret state police. Ernst Röhm, head of the party's stormtroopers, was born in Munich on the 28th of November 1887 in a modest household. His father worked for the railway. He joined the army in 1906 and during the First World War received the Iron Cross First Class. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, which would become the Nazi Party in 1920, and was a comrade and personal friend of Adolf Hitler. His short, robust build and a scar on his left cheek gave him a stern appearance. After the failure of the 1923 putsch, he withdrew from active involvement, and between 1928 and 1931-1930 served as a military advisor in Bolivia. He published defiant memoirs titled History of a Traitor. In 1930, Hitler wrote to him, inviting him to lead the SA again. Röhm assumed the role on the 5th of January 1931. Hitler expected this street-fighting force to intimidate opponents at rallies and campaigns, and that Röhm's connections with army officers would aid the party's rise. However, Röhm had radical plans. He aimed to create a Nazified state secret police from SA members and even aspired to absorb the Reichswehr into his ranks. In March of 1932, a meeting was held at his apartment in Goetheplatz, Munich, with Goebbels, Rudolf Hess and Himmler to discuss the future political police of the regime. They agreed it should be a Nazi organization under SS control, working with the party apparatus and the SA. When asked what kind of men would form this body, Himmler replied that they would be trained, not found ready-made. The decision left the stormtroopers with an ill-defined role. Röhm did not feel bound by the agreement. Hitler took a significant political risk by reintegrating Röhm. His inflexible personality was accompanied by a private life that sparked sexual scandal. He was openly homosexual, which was then a crime under Article 175 of the German Penal Code, and surrounded himself with young men of the same orientation. In the spring of 1932, the newspapers Münchener Post and Welter Montag published incriminating letters from Röhm to his doctor, Karl Günther Heimsoth, in which he confessed to homosexual practices and described relationships with women as unnatural. The letters were edited into a pamphlet by the Social Democrats during that year's presidential campaign, titled The Röhm Case, and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. The person who leaked the documents to the left-wing press was Rudolf Diels, head of the Prussian political police. Berlin prosecutors had copies of the letters while investigating the SA leader, but the case was shelved. The new national cabinet, formed on the 30th of January 1933, included only 3 Nazis: Hitler as Chancellor, Göring as Minister without portfolio, and Wilhelm Frick as Minister of the Interior. Frick, born on the 12th of March 1877 in Alsenz, Bavaria, had a legal education and had participated in the 1923 putsch. He was suspended and later reinstated, rising to Minister of the Interior in Thuringia in 1930 and head of the party's legal department. As a lawyer and official, he sought to unify state police forces into a centralized professional force. He knew this was challenging due to the federal system. Each state had its own police with a small group dedicated to political matters. Even in Prussia, there was no immediate mass Nazification. In the regime's first year, 1,453 officers deemed suspicious were dismissed, barely 7% of the total, and mostly from lower ranks. Recruitment for the political police and later the Gestapo was based on police experience rather than Nazi militancy. Diels would recall that the first officers were veteran officials who tried to resist the SA's violence, whose members despised bureaucrats and disobeyed legal orders. On the 22nd of February 1933, Göring signed a decree authorizing SA members to join as auxiliary police to suppress communists. Within weeks, these groups outnumbered the regular police, unleashing a wave of violence. Assaults, arbitrary arrests, and makeshift concentration camps where torture and extrajudicial executions took place. Diels testified at Nuremberg that many murders were disguised as escape attempts or resistance to arrest. It is estimated that around 40,000 people were interned in protective custody that year, and between 5,000 and 7,000 opponents died in 1933 alone. Witnesses like Heinz Graef, a law student in Berlin, recounted that in March of 1933, the SA, armed with machine guns and acting as auxiliary police, seized printing presses and newspapers under the protection of the state police. In Pirna, they occupied the local press, arrested staff and burned materials in the street. Werner Schäfer, commander of the Oranienburg camp, stated that Diels had close ties with SA leaders and that the camp received Berlin and Brandenburg's main opponents. He disputed Diels' account of non-violent interrogations, recalling a case where the Gestapo sent 2 severely beaten prisoners, prompting him to protest at Prince Albrechtstrasse. It was acknowledged that the prisoners had been beaten and should not have arrived in that condition. Hans Frank, the Minister of Justice in Munich, argued that the arbitrary arrests and tortures by the SA had to end. On the 2nd of August 1933, Göring dissolved the auxiliary police, and other states dispensed with the SA's services. Strict regulations were issued, establishing that only the Gestapo, with police support, could place individuals in protective custody. The SS took control of the camps and established internal rules. The decisive day for consolidating the Gestapo was the 27th of February 1933, with the Reichstag fire. Hitler went to the scene and told Diels there would be no mercy. The alleged perpetrator was Marinus van der Lubbe, an illiterate Dutch communist, though it was never clarified whether he acted alone, if it was a communist plot, or a Nazi pretext. Rumors circulated that Göring had planned it, and at Nuremberg, General Holder recalled him boasting about setting the fire. The following day, the government issued the Reichstag fire decree, drafted by Frick, which suspended constitutional freedoms and allowed the arrest of enemies of the people in protective custody without time limits or judicial review. Preventive custody was introduced for habitual criminals. Special tribunals were created in each state for political offences, and in July of 1934, the People's Court was established for serious cases like high treason. The decree not only gave the Gestapo detention powers, but also allowed the central government to appoint officials nationwide and prepare a national political police. The Gestapo was officially created by the first Gestapo law, issued by Göring on the 26th of April, 1933, with the mission to investigate political activities dangerous to the state. Initially, it operated only in Prussia and was outside judicial control. Regional offices were opened, and Diels sought the central headquarters at number 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin. Göring was appointed chief and took credit for its creation. Daily administration was handled by Diels as inspector. The administrative section was called Gestapo. The SS in Berlin viewed Diels as a conservative bureaucrat and began undermining his authority by spreading rumors of communist sympathies. In October of 1933, an SS group raided his home to discredit him, but he arrived with Gestapo agents and arrested the intruders. Göring, under pressure, placed him under house arrest. Terrified, Diels resigned and fled to Karlsbad. In reality, Göring planned to relocate him outside Berlin to ease the conflict. Göring replaced him with Paul Hinkler, a loyal Nazi with little administrative experience. Hinkler lasted only a month before Göring wrote to Diels, asking him to return and promising independence. Diels returned. The internal struggle led Frick to fear that the Gestapo would become a Nazi organ beyond state control. Göring responded with a decree removing it from the Ministry of the Interior and placing it under his direct jurisdiction as Prussian Prime Minister. On the 30th of November 1933, a second decree reinforced its independence. Meanwhile, Himmler worked to unify the political police of the various German states. In March of 1933, he founded the Dachau concentration camp, led by Theodor Eicke and guarded by SS members, which strengthened his power and linked the SS with the political police and the concentration camp system. Even so, he did not fully control Bavaria, as the SA had infiltrated the police, and thousands of their men formed the auxiliary security police. Gauleiter Adolf Wagner, concerned about the SA's brutality, asked Himmler to create a rival auxiliary force of SS members to contain them. Röhm did not object, believing the SS remained subordinate to his command, but this was a mistake. Himmler seized the opportunity to take control of all Bavarian political police, weakening the SA. On the 1st of April 1933, he was appointed Bavaria's political commander and began managing all camps with discipline. Himmler's rapid advance in Bavaria raised fears of an SS takeover of the entire state apparatus. Conservatives wanted an authoritarian state supported by legal institutions, not a totalitarian police. In May, Wagner limited protective custody to significant suspects. Himmler had other plans, and between September of 1933 and January of 1934, extended his control to Hamburg, Lübeck, Mecklenburg, Anhalt, Baden, Bremen, Hesse, Thuringia, and Württemberg. By January of 1934, Brunswick, Oldenburg, and Saxony were also under his command. Only Prussia and two small enclaves remained. At Nuremberg, speculation arose about whether Frick facilitated these takeovers due to his centralizing tendencies, but he denied it. Himmler's success stemmed from his regional tours, convincing leaders that the SS was better equipped to handle political and racial enemies than the SA or Frick's centralism. His model of a centralized Gestapo advanced outside Prussia. Göring, however, showed no intention of handing over his Prussian Gestapo to the ambitious SS chief. He even favored regulating protective custody further, and in March of 1934 decreed that all custodies must be authorized by the Berlin headquarters. To curb SS infiltration, Diels ordered that SS rank mattered less than police experience in recruitment, but he had to soften this due to pressure. Frick tried to regulate custody outside Prussia in April, but Himmler blocked him. Göring, increasingly concerned about Röhm and his talk of a second revolution, ultimately agreed to let the SS intervene. In speeches in July 1933, Hitler warned that any attempt at disorder would be suppressed and that the revolution must be channeled. He included Röhm in the cabinet without a portfolio on the 1st of December and sent him a letter of friendship published in the Völkischer Beobachter, but tensions persisted. In February 1934, Röhm presented a memorandum proposing that the SA replace the army. Defense Minister von Blomberg was outraged, and on the 28th of February, a meeting was held with Hitler, where Röhm signed an agreement not to attempt to replace the army. Göring decided to bring Himmler to Berlin and hand him control of the Gestapo. On the 1st of April 1934, Diels was transferred to Cologne as regional governor, presented as a promotion, but in reality a sidelining. Lena Heydrich would later recall the negotiations between Himmler and Göring to assume control, on the condition that Heydrich accompany him, something Göring feared due to Heydrich's arrogance. On the 20th of April 1934, Göring appointed Himmler inspector of the Gestapo, and Heydrich took over the Gestapo. Göring retained a ceremonial title, but the SS now controlled the entire secret police, with the obligation to keep him informed. From that day, the Gestapo had national jurisdiction. Frick would bitterly acknowledge that Himmler was becoming indispensable. Hitler travelled to Bavaria, and on the 30th of June 1934, at 4:30 in the morning, he arrived at Oberwiesenfeld. With an armed escort, he went to the Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee, where Röhm and his circle were staying. He entered quietly, first arresting Heines, who was found with a young troop leader, and then burst into Röhm's room, shouting that he was under arrest. All were taken to Stadelheim prison. The next day, Röhm was offered the chance to commit suicide by leaving a revolver in his cell. 10 minutes passed without a shot. Dachau commander Theodor Eicher and another officer entered armed. Röhm, standing and sweating, was shot multiple times in the torso and died instantly. In Munich, old scores were settled. Gustav von Kahr, who had betrayed Hitler in 1923, was beaten to death with pickaxes near Dachau. There were also mistakes. Music critic Willy Schmid was killed due to a name mix-up. In Berlin that same day, the SS killed former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and his wife in their home in front of their maid. Gregor Strasser was taken from his cell in the Gestapo headquarters and shot in the back, left to bleed out for an hour as Heydrich ordered. Hitler expressed surprise at Strasser's death. and it was never investigated. It was decided not to kill von Papen due to his prominence, but his aides were murdered, including his secretary Herbert von Bose. Heinrich Himmler and the Cross, the repressive apparatus against organized faith. Adolf Hitler, in his work Mein Kampf, harshly criticized Christian churches for ignoring what he called the Jewish problem. Although the Nazi Party's program promised tolerance toward religions as long as they did not affect the state or German racial purity, in reality, the regime sought to minimize the influence of organized religion. Despite the fact that in 1939, 95% of citizens in the former German territory declared themselves Christians, the government saw this as an obstacle. The number of atheists barely reached 1.5%, which explained why there were almost never popular denunciations against religious figures. To strengthen his image before the churches, Hitler promoted the signing of the Concordat with the Vatican in July 1933, represented by Franz von Papen and Eugenio Pacelli. This agreement theoretically guaranteed ecclesiastical independence, but in practice it served to limit the political participation of the clergy and consolidate the regime's control over religious life. However, these gestures concealed a systematic strategy. Churches had to conform to Nazi rules or face repression. Heinrich ordered the Gestapo to devise plans to detect any sign of religious opposition. Himmler, while publicly speaking of respect for the sacred, privately despised the clergy. During the regime, Catholic schools were closed, religious youth organizations were dissolved, and ecclesiastical properties were seized without compensation. Hundreds of German priests ended up in concentration camps, particularly in Dachau. This type of persecution was not entirely new. Decades earlier, Chancellor Bismarck had initiated a similar offensive against the Catholic Church in Prussia. Although the Gestapo sought to weaken the churches, it avoided interrupting masses. An internal order from May 1935 urged the monitoring of clerics, but prohibited interference in religious services. The Protestant Evangelical Church, which had 40 million followers in Germany, had a decentralized structure. Many of its pastors sympathized with the Nazis. Around 40% were party members in 1933. From this environment emerged the German Christians movement, which sought a unified church loyal to the regime, excluding non-Aryan clerics and reinterpreting biblical texts to eliminate Jewish elements. In ecclesiastical elections held in July 1933, they gained a majority and appointed Ludwig Müller as national bishop. In response to this radicalization, a resistance movement emerged led by Martin Niemöller. Although initially a nationalist who supported Hitler, he opposed the manipulation of liturgical content. In 1934, a synod in Barmen condemned the doctrines of Nazified Christianity. Shortly afterward, the Pastoral Emergency League was founded, the precursor to the Confessing Church. It included 9,000 pastors, mostly university-educated and unaffiliated with the Nazi Party. By 1935, the regime admitted it would not succeed in reforming the churches and created a Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs to control dissenters. That same year, the Gestapo established a specific unit, called IVB, to address religious matters. It included former Catholic and Protestant priests whose experience aided in designing repressive methods. One of the monitored pastors was Enke Hanse from Cologne. In 1937, during a mass in Wuppertal attended by over 1,000 people, he denounced the suffering of persecuted clerics and the disregard for Christian values. Another pastor, named Hamburg, warned about mass arrests. Although they were not immediately detained, 2 years later, Enke was arrested following a report for participating in an unauthorized ecclesiastical examination. He claimed he was no longer part of the organizing committee, and with no solid evidence, he was released in 1940. The Gestapo's approach was occasionally cautious with confessing church leaders. Cases rarely reached trial, and judges were often conservative rather than fanatical Nazis. The arrest of Niemöller, the most prominent religious opponent, occurred in 1937. He was transferred to a prison in Berlin and later to the Sachsenhausen camp. Despite a smear campaign in the press, the court acquitted him in 1938. Outraged, Hitler ordered his continued detention. His wife pleaded for his release, but Hitler responded that he would again lead a resistance movement. Even so, the confessing church did not disappear, though by 1938, most pastors had sworn loyalty to the Führer. Niemöller survived, but never ceased to regret his silence regarding the persecution of Jews. That guilt led him to write his well-known testimony about indifference. First they came for the socialists, then for me, and there was no one left. His case demonstrated the caution the Gestapo applied to certain Protestant clerics. The Gestapo intensified surveillance against clerics who criticized the regime or defended values incompatible with Nazism. Some ecclesiastical leaders began sending private letters between bishops, which were later intercepted by security services. An example was the letter from Protestant Bishop Theophil Wurm, questioning state interference in religious matters. For this reason, he was monitored for years, though never formally prosecuted. Other clerics, aware of the Gestapo's network of spies and civilian informants, moderated their public speeches and resorted to indirect messages to avoid sanctions. In the case of the Catholic Church, repressive actions followed a similar pattern. Although the Concordat remained in effect on paper, local authorities found ways to limit its enforcement. In Bavaria, for example, properties of religious orders were confiscated without legal justification. Catholic schools were progressively closed, and priests who made critical remarks in homilies were reported. Some were arrested and sent to Dachau, where a specific block existed for clerics. One of the most representative cases was that of Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen of Münster. In 1941, during 3 public sermons, he firmly denounced the regime's euthanasia policy, unjustified arrests and abuses against people with disabilities. The Gestapo immediately investigated him. However, fearing a larger scandal among Catholics in Western Germany, Hitler ordered that he not be arrested. Despite this, several priests close to him were detained and sent to camps. The repressive strategy intensified during the war. Surveillance extended to smaller religious communities, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused military service and salutes to the Führer. Thousands of them were arrested and many died in concentration camps. The Gestapo also monitored Freemasons, considering them part of an international conspiracy, and Catholics who collaborated with foreign intelligence or humanitarian aid networks. Internal reports showed that the Gestapo was not always effective. Some cases against priests were shelved due to lack of evidence, and trials against respected religious figures were avoided to prevent public scandals. Over time, repression became more targeted. Clerics who challenged the regime were singled out and classified according to their loyalty. Those deemed subversive were monitored, with their sermons and letters under constant review. Despite the control, many religious figures continued their work. Some helped persecuted families, officiated secret masses, or distributed banned publications. The Gestapo sometimes tolerated these practices as long as they remained private. The Gestapo and the art of turning suspicion into evidence. When agents failed to gather conclusive evidence, investigations shifted to reconstructing the detainees' close connections. The file was built with backgrounds of collaborators, co-workers, or residential contacts, thus broadening the scope of surveillance. The strategy relied less on direct confessions and more on identifying minimal networks of relationships, which were then exploited to justify further interventions. Cooperation between the Gestapo and local police forces was key. Although secret agents operated as a separate unit, they needed uniformed officers to carry out mass arrests. Additionally, many officials who had previously worked in regular criminal departments were integrated into the new repressive structure. Some joined out of conviction, others to retain their positions in the new regime. Communists knew they were being targeted, but many chose to remain active. Underground propaganda, pamphlet distribution, and secret meetings continued during the early months. This forced the Gestapo to create units dedicated exclusively to infiltration tasks. Informants who had been party members or pretended to be sympathizers were recruited. Some were enlisted after being detained and offered freedom or minor benefits in exchange for collaboration. One of the most effective aspects of the system was the use of citizen denunciations. Authorities promoted the idea that reporting a suspicious neighbor was a patriotic act. In working-class neighborhoods, especially those with a history of leftist sympathies, hundreds of anonymous denunciations emerged. A single unsigned letter was enough for the Gestapo to launch an investigation. In many cases, the content was vague, but agents responded regardless. Sometimes the mere receipt of a denunciation was sufficient to interrogate someone or search their home. The phenomenon of denunciations became a structural tool of the repressive apparatus. The Gestapo had limited personnel to cover the entire territory, and citizens acted as additional censors. Every letter that arrived at the office was read, filed, and met with some form of action. Some were based on personal rivalries or disputes over inheritances or housing. Even so, they were treated as legitimate signals. Archives show that denunciations often contained phrases like, "I heard them speak ill of the Führer," or "I saw lights on late at night and people coming and going." Comments made in breadlines or at family gatherings were also reported. Surveillance no longer depended solely on authorities but extended to all levels of daily life. In some areas, denunciations were so frequent that Gestapo agents had waiting lists to process them. Some tried to prioritize those that seemed more substantiated, but in practice all were investigated. It didn't matter if they came from a reliable source or if the content was ambiguous. Internal statistics indicated that a significant proportion of arrests originated from anonymous letters. A side effect of this system was the complete erosion of trust between neighbors. Suspicion settled into streets, buildings, and shared courtyards. Speaking too much or expressing doubts could be enough to become a target. Some used the system to settle personal scores. The Gestapo, rather than filtering motives, preferred to receive more information, even if imprecise, rather than let potential threats slip through. In specific cases, the Gestapo combined denunciations with direct surveillance. If a letter reported a family for suspicious behavior, an agent was assigned to discreetly observe for several days. Everything was noted: comings and goings, visitors, lights, sounds. If something seemed unusual, a raid was organized. If nothing was found, it was recorded, but the name remained on file. Some detainees discovered that their own family members had sent the denunciations. Children, siblings, or spouses, driven by fear, jealousy, or external pressure, turned in their own. At times, the Gestapo encouraged these conflicts by offering protection or privileges in exchange for internal information. This created an environment where no one was entirely sure who might be collaborating. In certain districts, schools and employers also participated in this system. Teachers reported students who displayed critical attitudes, and factory bosses reported suspicious comments. The logic was preventive: better to act before something happened. This reinforced the image of an omnipresent state that listened and watched at all times. At the same time, Gestapo agents developed standardized routines for processing denunciations. Each letter was numbered, classified by content and region, and answered with an action card. If a denunciation matched existing information, the procedure was expedited. For new cases, a file was opened and interviews were initiated. Local offices worked with forms that outlined specific steps, from verification to arrest. The pressure to deliver results was constant. Superiors demanded arrest figures, and reports had to show progress. This incentivized agents to act even with weak evidence. The system rewarded visible activity, not precision. Consequently, arrests were often made first and verified later. In cities like Düsseldorf, Cologne, or Leipzig, Gestapo offices received so many letters that some weeks exceeded 150 denunciations. The volume of work forced the establishment of internal systems to filter and distribute tasks among personnel. Although many letters contained ambiguous language or generalities, the instruction was to take them seriously. No denunciation was to be discarded without at least a cursory review. The administration of fear required neither uniforms nor weapons. A letter signed with initials or a call from a phone booth was enough to trigger an investigation. Even when no evidence was found, simply appearing in the files left a mark. That notation could affect future decisions regarding employment, housing, or personal movements. Some citizens came forward in person to denounce without hiding their identity. In those cases, agents often interrogated the informant to gather more details. Sometimes new names emerged during the conversation, and that was enough to expand the list of suspects. Although not all reports led to arrests, they did contribute to forming social relationship maps that the Gestapo used as a guide for its operations. Homes with prior records were monitored more regularly. Janitors or doormen were key informants in many neighborhoods. They were instructed to observe unusual movements, suspicious packages, or frequent visitors. Some collaborated voluntarily, others under pressure or for convenience. Their reports were especially valued because they knew the environment well. As the surveillance network expanded, any contact with foreigners also became a cause for suspicion. Some reports warned about neighbors receiving letters from abroad or speaking different languages at home. The idea was to prevent any communication channel that escaped state control. The Gestapo considered these signs as possible connections to communist networks in exile. Repression was not limited to breaking up meetings or arresting leaders. It also extended to the personal environments of suspects, creating a widespread climate of surveillance and self-censorship. Increasingly, citizens were aware that their actions, words, or connections could be used against them without warning. The Gestapo's priority shifted from neutralizing specific enemies to keeping entire sectors of society under control. The Files of Silence: How the Gestapo Classified Life and Morality. Official records began to fill with cases of people without a fixed address, sex workers, women accused of leading a licentious life, alcoholics, and those without steady employment. All were labeled as asocials, a broad and deliberately ambiguous category. This classification also included the Romani, accused of maintaining customs contrary to the National Socialist racial order. The Gestapo created specific profiles for these individuals, documented them, and requested their preventive internment, even without clear evidence of crimes. Internal orders prioritized prevention, which authorized acting preemptively. The legal basis for this strategy was an expanded interpretation of the decree on internment for security reasons. In practice, this meant that any behavior deemed suspicious could lead to indefinite arrest. Constant surveillance became the main method for detecting conduct that deviated from what was considered acceptable. Investigations often began based on reports from local offices, regular police, or even neighbors. The procedures used against the Romani reflected a policy combining institutional racism with systematic police practices. From the mid-1930s, detailed files on Romani families began to be compiled, noting everything from family ties to alleged criminal behavior. Although in many cases there was no concrete evidence, inclusion on prior lists was enough to justify repressive measures. The Gestapo actively participated in this classification, creating extensive profiles and endorsing their internment in special camps. Raids against the Romani were carried out in a planned manner. In several cities, arrests were made based on censuses previously compiled by other state offices. Detainees were transferred to internment centers without the need for a trial. In some cases, municipal authorities themselves collaborated enthusiastically in these procedures, providing information, vehicles, or even temporary facilities for holding the arrested. The Gestapo's work was not limited to executing orders, but also included drafting reports on the dangerousness of each group. These documents noted that the Romani, due to their nomadic lifestyle, did not meet the state's surveillance requirements. This supposed inability to be administratively controlled became sufficient justification for preventive measures. They were often attributed a natural inclination to crime, without any individual analysis of their actual behavior. The Gestapo's reports also mentioned the alleged inferior biological heritage of certain individuals. These notes were used to bolster arguments for forced sterilization or indefinite confinement. Files repeatedly used phrases like incapable of integrating into the national community or carrier of hereditary antisocial traits. This language soon extended to other marginalized groups, such as people with intellectual disabilities, chronic alcoholics, and habitual unemployed individuals. One of the most commonly used procedures was administrative internment without prior trial. The decision was made in local committees where the Gestapo had a decisive voice. It was enough for an agent to validate a file for the person to be transferred to a labor or concentration camp. Those affected had no means of appeal or right to judicial review. In some cases, not even their families were informed of their whereabouts. Men who engaged in same-sex relationships were also targeted for repression. Although penal legislation against homosexuality predated National Socialism, punishments intensified during the regime. The Gestapo used informants to locate meeting places and arrest attendees. Arrests were carried out selectively, prioritizing those considered spreaders of the behavior. In many cases, they were forced to sign confessions under duress and sent to camps where they faced particularly violent treatment. Operations against homosexual individuals were justified under arguments of moral hygiene and protection of youth. The Gestapo collected third-party testimonies, used covert surveillance, and even resorted to entrapment to provoke arrest situations. Files included photographs, signed statements, and analyses of the accused's social environment. This documentation was treated as confidential, but shared with other agencies to ensure the detainees' exclusion from employment, housing, and community life. In some cases, the arrested were coerced into providing information about acquaintances or social circles under the threat of harsher punishments. This dynamic fostered a network of mutual surveillance, where the fear of being denounced outweighed any possibility of defense. Legal consequences varied but often resulted in prolonged imprisonment, forced labor, or re-education through internment in special regime camps. Gestapo files noted whether the accused had shown a defiant attitude or persistent tendency, which directly influenced their final fate. The persecution also extended to women who, according to official criteria, lived outside expected social behavior. Single mothers, those who frequently changed partners, or those accused of vagrancy, were categorized as asocial females. The Gestapo received constant reports from municipal agencies and regime-affiliated women's organizations. These reports were based on personal observations, rumors, and analyses of family environments. Many of these women were sent to internment camps under vague charges. Official documents spoke of risk to public morality or negative influence on the community. In some cases, they were wives of political prisoners or women connected to persecuted individuals. Despite lacking judicial convictions, they were treated as potential threats. The Gestapo considered their lifestyle capable of weakening social cohesion, justifying their exclusion from public life. Arrests were carried out discreetly, without judicial proceedings or prior notice. Detainees were registered, interrogated, and transferred to camps where they were placed in separate barracks. Files were completed with notes on past behavior, family ties, and potential dangerous contacts. These notes influenced the duration of internment and the type of work assigned. Decisions were made without the right to appeal, and relatives were rarely informed. Another category targeted by the Gestapo was people with physical or mental disabilities. Although specific institutions existed for their treatment, the regime promoted their social isolation and, in certain cases, their direct elimination. The Gestapo received lists from hospitals, educational centers, and care homes. Based on these records, it evaluated which individuals should be transferred to facilities where forced sterilization or euthanasia was applied. Documents used technical terms to describe supposed levels of uselessness, without assessing the actual situation of each case. Transfers were conducted through coordinated routes between various agencies. Families were not informed of the patient's final whereabouts. Some archives contained letters from parents requesting information that was never answered. The Gestapo kept files under lock and key, and in many cases destroyed portions to avoid traceable records. Internal instructions indicated that anyone deemed unfit to contribute to the German people should be removed from the general system. One of the programs in which the Gestapo had direct participation was the so-called corrective compulsory labor. Under this legal figure, individuals labeled as recidivist asocials were forced to join special brigades under constant surveillance. The assignment did not depend on a formal conviction, but on a subjective evaluation of character. These individuals were sent to farms, factories, or urban cleaning services, where they worked without a fixed salary or labor rights. Absences, complaints, or escape attempts were punished with immediate confinement in harsher camps. During the war years, the pressure on these groups intensified. The Gestapo argued that, in times of national emergency, it was necessary to cleanse the social body of unstable elements. This idea was reinforced through internal circulars ordering intensified campaigns against vagrants, alcoholics, prostitutes, and those identified as unproductive. The phrase, incapable of contributing to the war effort, was frequently used to justify mass arrests. Judging the hunters, the trial against the Gestapo. After the defeat of the Third Reich, the Allied forces opened the first interrogation centers in occupied cities. These centers held former Gestapo agents, many of whom sought to justify their roles within the regime. Initial interviews revealed a system far broader than investigators had imagined. In the first rounds of interrogations, the Allies focused on establishing a pattern of participation among the detainees. Beyond personal accounts, investigators began cross-referencing testimonies with recovered internal documents, operational orders, and detention records. This comparison allowed them to detect contradictions, hidden hierarchies, and connections between departments. What initially seemed like a set of scattered functions revealed a more coordinated structure than previously thought. This approach marked a turning point in how subsequent judicial processes were conducted. The Allies, for their part, began classifying members of the Nazi apparatus into different groups. At that moment, the goal was not to judge them immediately, but to analyze each individual's level of involvement in the regime's operations. This process was long and complex. As more data was collected, evidence emerged of what had occurred in detention centers. Witness statements, combined with recovered documents, revealed a network of systematic actions against the civilian population. Thus began the formal identification of crimes committed by Gestapo members. The Nuremberg trials served as a model, but the judicial process for Gestapo agents took a different path. Instead of a single large trial, regional hearings were held. Many of these were driven by the occupying military authorities. The British, for example, coordinated proceedings in their zones of control, where numerous former agents were concentrated. Evidence was presented through testimonies and concrete documents. Unlike other processes, the focus here was on a specific reconstruction of facts and individual responsibilities. Many defendants tried to minimize their roles, claiming minor functions or fear of reprisals. However, interrogations revealed contradictions. Documents directly mentioned them. This discrepancy between accounts and evidence was key to determining responsibilities. One of the key focuses during the judicial processes was to establish the extent to which the accused had acted with knowledge and direct participation in specific crimes. The prosecution presented documents with lists of detentions, internal communications, and operational orders that demonstrated the systematic use of repressive methods. Cases of executions without trial and procedures carried out by identified agents were exposed. Several defendants claimed they were following external orders or were unaware of the detainees' final fate, but records disproved these versions. The names of many appeared in memoranda and official files, allowing their degree of involvement to be reconstructed with precision. Sentences varied depending on the proven degree of involvement. Some received prison terms while others were released due to lack of evidence. In certain cases, convicted individuals later returned to administrative roles years after. The judicial process was fragmented, without a uniform pattern. Each regional tribunal had its own criteria, and the outcomes did not always follow a common logic. This disparity generated controversies that persisted over time. Some historians have questioned the lack of coherence in the sentences, while others emphasize that it was the first serious attempt to judge a modern repressive network. Several of the tried agents returned to civilian life without being recognized. Some changed their names or moved to other cities. In West Germany, authorities prioritized institutional reconstruction, which reduced attention on former Nazi officials. Only decades later were investigations into these cases resumed. By then, many of those involved had died. The Gestapo, as a structure, disappeared with the war, but its practices left lasting traces. The surveillance, control, and repression techniques developed during the regime were closely observed by other governments, even after the conflict. The last significant trial against a former Gestapo agent took place many years after the war's end. The accused was prosecuted for crimes committed in Eastern Europe. The case included survivor testimonies and new evidence found in declassified archives. Although it was an isolated case, it reopened the debate about memory, justice, and time. Meanwhile, the historical archive continued to grow, and with it the possibility of understanding the role of this institution with greater precision. The Gestapo ceased to be merely a symbol of terror and became a subject of detailed study.